Ready to get into some Michelle Alexander.
Let's do it. Always up for a deep dive into the new Jim Crow.
So we're tackling chapters 2 and 3 today, really focusing on how the war on drugs, even without like explicitly racist laws, has created this whole system of racialized social control.
It's wild, right? How these seemingly neutral policies can have such wildly different impacts depending on, well.
Exactly. And that's what we're going to unpack. Let's jump right in. This lockdown idea that Alexander talks about. She argues that the war on drugs basically incentivized law enforcement to, well, make a profit.
Yeah, it's like they created a business model out of law enforcement.
Seriously, between 1988 and 92, drug task forces seized over $1 billion through asset forfeiture. $1 billion. It's insane.
Think about the implications of that,
Sure,
right?
man.
Suddenly the focus shifts. It's less about actually disrupting major drug operations and more about, well, seizing assets, padding those stats.
Okay, but some people would say asset forfeiture, even if it's got problems, is a necessary tool, to fight organized crime and stuff.
Sure, that's a valid point.
Mm.
But Alexander's argument is that it hits the poor the hardest. They can't afford to fight back, even if the seizures are totally bogus.
Right.
While the wealthy, they can basically buy their freedom by forfeiting some assets. Two-tiered justice system in action.
And then you combine that profit motive with this intense pressure to get results, and it's like...
A recipe for abuse.
Exactly, like that Western Area Narcotics Task Force case, the WAN case. They were seizing pocket change. I mean, come on. Clearly, they weren't focused on busting up some massive drug ring.
Absolutely. And then you have to ask, what happens to the people caught in this system? What are the chances they're actually getting a fair shake legally? Spoiler alert, not great.
It's rough. Alexander talks about these chronically underfunded public defender systems, lack of resources, constant pressure to plead guilty. It's just heartbreaking. Like the case of James Thomas.
Oh, yeah.
The guy spent 8.5 years in jail just waiting for a murder trial that never even happened. They finally dismissed the case because his alibi witness died while he was rotting in jail.
It's a nightmare scenario. And it's not just the underfunding, right?
Mm-hmm.
The whole system is designed to push people towards plea bargains.
Mm-hmm.
You've got these mandatory minimum sentences for drug offenses hanging over your head.
It's like this huge threat, right? You're facing decades in prison, so you take the deal. Guilty or not.
Makes you wonder about the whole concept of justice.
And the crazy thing is, the U.S. Sentencing Commission, they've even admitted that these mandatory minimums are often used as bargaining chips, not even meant to be fully served.
So the focus shifts from actual guilt or innocence to just, like, closing cases, getting that plea deal.
It's a conveyor belt straight to prison. And that's where the whole racial element of this really starts to glare.
Right. This is what Alexander calls the color of justice. How these policies, these seemingly colorblind policies, they end up having these massively disproportionate racial impacts.
It's crazy. Alexander points out that drug usage rates are pretty similar across races. Mm-hmm. But who gets caught in the system? Who ends up behind bars?
Right. And think about that study she mentions, that 1995 study, when they asked people to picture a drug user. 95% pictured a black person.
It's ingrained, right? It's like the media and politicians have successfully created this image in everyone's minds. Drug crime equals black and brown people, even though the data shows otherwise.
It's how you can have mass incarceration of people of color without explicitly racist laws. The system itself is built that way.
So, to recap, we've got this system that's all about incentivizing arrests and seizures, pressuring people into plea deals, targeting people of color, and all while making it almost impossible to challenge any of it in court. It's grim.
Grim is putting it mildly.
Yeah, this is heavy stuff. But we're just getting started. We'll dig into the implications of all this and what can actually be done to dismantle it when we come back. We've been talking about this whole system, how the war on drugs has basically fueled this mass incarceration of people of color, even without those, like, explicitly racist laws,
Right, it's about these underlying systems. The incentives for law enforcement, the pressure to take plea deals, and how all of that disproportionately targets people of color.
It's wild. And one of the things that really hit me hard in the new Jim Crow is this idea of the prison label. How mass incarceration, it's not just about the time you serve. It's about creating this whole permanent underclass through that label, felon.
It's like a scarlet letter, right?
Yeah.
It follows you everywhere.
Totally. Even after you've done your time, you're basically denied all these opportunities. Housing, jobs, education, even voting.
It's tough, right? You serve your time, you're supposed to be able to reintegrate back into society.
Hmm.
But with that label hanging over you,
It's almost impossible. And it just feeds into itself, you know? You get labeled a criminal, denied opportunities, pushed to the margins of society, and then when you inevitably struggle, the system's like, see? We told you so.
it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. And guess who gets caught in that cycle the most?
Communities of color, perpetuating the same racial disparities that the system claims to be, like, colorblind to.
The irony, right?
It's brutal. But I guess some people would argue that those restrictions are there for a reason, right? To protect public safety, make sure people who committed crimes are held accountable.
Sure, that's the argument.
Yeah.
But Alexander, she pushes back on that hard. She asks if these restrictions actually do what they claim, or if they're really just about creating this permanent underclass, keeping those already vulnerable communities marginalized.
So it's not really about safety or accountability.
Well, that's the question, isn't it? It's about taking a hard look at what purpose these restrictions really serve.
And for Alexander, this is a new form of racial caste system, plain and simple, where people of color are disproportionately relegated to the bottom rung, denied opportunities, stripped of their rights.
And this isn't about individual cases, right, or isolated incidents of discrimination. We're talking about a system designed to produce these very outcomes.
She calls it closing the courthouse doors, right? How the legal system has basically made it impossible to actually challenge racial bias.
Like we talked about earlier, cases like Wren v. United States and McCluskey v. Camp, they've created this legal landscape where even if you can show clear statistical evidence of racial disparities, it's almost impossible to prove actual intent. You know, like intentional discrimination in the courts.
Yeah, you'd have to, like, read the minds of every judge, every cop. It's insane.
And without that ability to challenge the system, to hold those in power accountable, the injustices just continue.
So Alexander says we need to move beyond individual intent. We need to focus on those systemic factors that create these racial disparities.
It's not enough to just say, well, I'm not racist. We have to understand how our actions, even those that seem race neutral, might contribute to a system that's hurting people of color.
So it's not enough to not be racist. You have to be anti-racist.
Right. You have to actively work against the systems of oppression.
We need to look in the mirror, folks. This is a call to action for everyone.
It's a call to consciousness, really, to confront our own biases, to recognize how we might be complicit, even unknowingly.
Okay, so we've got this system that creates a permanent underclass through that felon label. It makes it near impossible to challenge racial bias in court. And it relies on unconscious biases and policies that look neutral on paper to create these messed up, racially disparate outcomes. I mean, where do we even go from here? It feels overwhelming.
It is a lot, but Alexander doesn't leave us hanging. She offers this roadmap for change. It's multi-pronged, you know. We need to tackle those legal barriers, reform the policies that are driving mass incarceration, and really shift the cultural narratives that fuel these injustices.
Let's break that down a bit. Let's start with those legal barriers. What can actually be done to, like, open up the courthouse doors again, make it easier to challenge racial bias in the system?
Well, a big one would be overturning or revising some of those Supreme Court rulings that have made it so tough to prove discriminatory intent. Like McCluskey v. Kemp, you know, where statistical evidence alone isn't enough. That needs to change.
Right. But even if we could somehow magically fix those legal barriers, we're still stuck with these policies that are driving mass incarceration in the first place.
Absolutely. And that's where ending the war on drugs comes in.
Yeah, that's a big one.
It means shifting from this criminal justice mindset to a public health approach. Treat drug use like the health issue it is. Focus on treatment and prevention, not punishment and prison.
So, like, instead of funding more cops in prisons, we'd be investing in community-based drug treatment programs, mental health services, actual support systems. It's a huge shift, right?
It is, but we know the current system isn't working. We've been waging this war on drugs for decades, and it hasn't solved the problem. It's time to try something new, something that's actually based on, evidence and compassion.
Okay, so ending the war on drugs is a start, but what about those mandatory minimum sentences? Those seem like a huge driver of mass incarceration, especially for drug offenses.
Alexander's clear. Get rid of them. They take away power from judges, forcing them to hand down these harsh sentences, even when it doesn't make sense.
And it just adds to that pressure to take plea bargains, even if you're innocent.
Exactly. Eliminating those would give judges back some discretion, let them consider each case individually, and hand down sentences that are actually fair.
So we've got end the war on drugs, eliminate mandatory minimums, and tackle those legal barriers that prevent challenging racial bias. Those are some big picture changes. But what about us, the regular folks listening to this? What can we actually do to help make this happen?
A lot, actually. One of the most powerful things we can do is educate ourselves and then educate others. Alexander's book is a great starting point, but there are tons of resources out there, articles, documentaries, podcasts. We need to learn about this, understand the complexities of mass incarceration and how it's impacting communities of color.
And once we understand the problem, then we can start looking for ways to get involved, right?
Exactly. Support organizations working on criminal justice reform. Contact your elected officials. Make some noise. Let them know you want them to support policies that promote racial justice. And don't be afraid to speak out against injustice whenever you see it.
Use your voice, people. Make it heard.
And we can challenge those harmful narratives, too. The stereotypes. You hear someone making broad generalizations about criminals or repeating racist tropes about people of color and crime. Call them out. Don't let it slide.
We all need to be more mindful, right? Yeah. About our own language, about how we might be unconsciously perpetuating these harmful ideas.
It's not always comfortable confronting these issues, especially when they challenge our own beliefs. But it's necessary if we actually want to build a just and equitable society.
And Alexander reminds us that this isn't a quick fix. Change takes time. It takes sustained effort, commitment, a willingness to really challenge the status quo.
But she also offers hope. She believes we have the power to dismantle this system, to create a more just and humane society for everyone.
That's a vision worth fighting for. And on that note, I think it's a good time to take a pause, reflect on what we've covered. We've gone deep, but there's still more to explore. When we come back, we'll dive into some of the solutions Alexander proposes and really try to envision what a truly just and equitable criminal justice system could look like. So we've really dug into some tough stuff in this deep dive. The war on drugs, mass incarceration, this whole system that seems to be working against people of color. It's a lot.
Yeah, it's heavy. But like we've been saying, Alexander doesn't just leave us with a sense of despair, right? She actually offers some hope, a vision for a different kind of future.
Okay, so let's talk about solutions. Concrete steps, How do we actually dismantle this system of mass incarceration? And what do we replace it with? Something better, hopefully.
Well, she's very clear about one thing. We have to end the war on drugs. It's been a massive failure.
But doesn't that sound kind of, radical? Like, wouldn't ending the war on drugs just lead to more crime and chaos? I mean, there's got to be a reason we've been fighting this war for so long, right?
I get it. It sounds scary. But I think that fear comes from a misunderstanding of what ending the war on drugs actually means. It doesn't mean just legalizing everything and letting things run wild. It's about shifting our whole approach, moving away from this criminal justice framework and towards a public health framework.
So instead of treating drug use like a crime to be punished, we treat it like a health issue.
Right. And that means focusing on treatment, prevention, harm reduction strategies.
Makes sense. But what would that look like in practice?
Think community-based treatment programs, expanding access to mental health services, providing support to people struggling with addiction, and crucially, addressing those underlying social and economic conditions that contribute to drug use in the first place. Poverty, lack of opportunity, trauma, all of that.
Okay, so a huge shift in perspective. Do you think it's actually doable, though?
I mean, it might seem radical, but it's really just common sense. The current system clearly isn't working. We've been waging this war for decades, and drug use hasn't gone away. It's gotten worse in a lot of ways. We need to try something different, something that's based on evidence, on compassion, not fear and punishment.
Okay, I'm with you. Ending the war on drugs. It's a big one, but it makes sense. What else needs to change?
Sentencing. Specifically, those mandatory minimum sentences we talked about earlier.
Right. Those have been a huge driver of mass incarceration, especially for drug offenses.
Exactly. They tie judges' hands, forcing them to give out harsh sentences, even when it's clearly not appropriate. And they put so much pressure on people to take plea deals, even if they're innocent.
So getting rid of mandatory minimums, give judges back some power to make decisions based on individual circumstances.
Exactly. More flexibility, more fairness. Let them hand down sentences that are actually proportionate, Make sense for the individual case.
Makes sense. And what about all those consequences that come with a felony conviction, that prison label that Alexander talks about?
Right, those collateral consequences. It's like you're punished twice. Once for the actual crime, and then again for the rest of your life.
Right.
Denied housing, jobs, education, voting rights. It's this never-ending cycle of exclusion.
It's like, how are you supposed to reintegrate back into society, rebuild your life, if you're constantly being shut out.
Exactly. So we need to rethink those collateral consequences. Do they actually protect public safety, or are they just creating this permanent underclass, keeping people trapped? We need to give people a chance to turn their lives around.
So ending the war on drugs, eliminating mandatory minimums, rethinking those collateral consequences, that's a good start. But what about the legal stuff? Those barriers that make it so hard to even challenge racial bias in the system. How do we deal with that?
We need legal reforms, plain and simple. Make it easier to actually hold the system accountable for its racial biases.
You're talking about the Supreme Court rulings again? Like Ware v. United States and McCleskey v. Kemp.
Those are prime examples. They basically give law enforcement free rein to do whatever they want. Engage in racial profiling and discriminatory practices, knowing they'll probably never face any real consequences.
So overturn or revise those precedents. And what else? What kind of reforms are we talking about?
Well, we need legislation that specifically outlaws racial profiling and create mechanisms for real independent oversight of law enforcement. No more cops policing themselves. No, we need accountability.
It's a tall order, for sure, all of this. Do you really think it's possible to actually make these changes happen? I mean, the system is so entrenched.
Change is always possible, but it doesn't happen magically. It takes work, sustained effort, people willing to challenge the status quo. And I think Alexander's book, it's been a huge part of sparking that conversation about mass incarceration and its impact on communities of color. That's a start. Now we need to turn that talk into action.
So what can we do? What can our listeners do to get involved, to push for these changes?
Well, there are organizations out there doing incredible work on criminal justice reform. Support them. Donate. Volunteer. Spread the word.
And put pressure on your elected officials. Let them know this is an issue you care about. Make them listen.
Right. Vote. Make your voice heard in the political process.
And remember, this isn't just about policy changes. It's about changing hearts and minds, too. It starts with each of us, looking at our own biases, being willing to challenge our own assumptions.
Like Alexander says, personal transformation is a big part of this.
Exactly. We have to listen to the experiences of people who have been directly impacted by this system and commit to creating a world that's more just and inclusive for everyone.
Well, this has been a deep dive in every sense of the word. A huge thank you to you for joining us, for shedding light on this incredibly important issue.
Thanks for having me.
And to all our listeners out there, thank you for tuning in. Remember, change starts with each of us. Don't stay silent. Educate yourselves. Get involved. Speak out against injustice. Together, we can create a better future.